Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 244. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing today?
I'm great, Kyle. How are you?
Doing all right, Connor. And we got a lot on the show today, including an update on the Iran nuclear talks, which have in most everybody's reporting, including on this show, taking a bad seat to what's going on in Ukraine the past couple of weeks. But reports are that we're very close to an agreement. And you wrote a great piece on this for the news section of the Libertarian Institute that's out today. I really recommend everybody check out your article and everything we got going on at the Libertarian Institute, which is, of course, where this show is hosted. So, everybody, check out the Institute. Also, antiwar.com. The show's on the blog. A lot of what myself and Will Porter have been writing, and even some of what Connor's writing, is probably going to end up over there. And then share the show. You can find it on YouTube, Rumble, and Odyssey, video version, Facebook and Twitter account. The Twitter handle is con_interest. And then you can donate to the show directly at Patreon, Subscribestar, and Crypto. Crypto information is in the show notes page. And the sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. They have a wide selection of high quality CBD products there, Connor. What do you like at Paloma Verde?
I'm a huge fan of the soft gels, and I take those, after you eat. It give you, great relief from any kind of like anxiety, or if you drank too much coffee, if you got some pain, if you're going out for a run later, you just feel better and you'll recover quicker in your workouts. The tinctures are probably the best bang for your buck because it's the strongest stuff in the highest quantity. They have, delicious flavors to go along with that. I really like the mint flavor, and then those gummy bears, which are just fantastic. And those are extremely fast acting and delicious. So yeah, check it all out.
PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Connor, let's get into the show. And I want to start off today with coverage on Iran, including your brand new news article out for us at the Libertarian Institute titled Iran Nuclear Deal Revival Appears Imminent, but Issues Remain. So Connor, what the hell's going on here?
Okay, so I'm going to start just by really quickly going over this piece from Middle East Eye about this was, 3 or 4 days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So and I think the last time we spoke about Iran, I think it was maybe in the 17th or something like that. So just want to give a quick review here of what the status was before the invasion, and then we'll get into my article because the fallout of Russia invading Ukraine is now potentially going to kind of derail the progress that we've been seeing, where it's kind of been expected that a deal is imminent. So, so back at the end in late February, again before the invasion, Saeed Khatibzadeh, the foreign ministry spokesman for Iran, was saying that significant progress had been made and a number of outstanding obstacles have been considerably reduced. He said the remaining issues are however, he did say the remaining issues are the hardest. Said this during a press briefing. We had American officials telling the Wall Street Journal that a deal was a mere 2 days away, or, a couple of days. Jen Psaki, the White House spokeswoman, was saying that, talks were progressing substantially, but, quote, nothing is agreed on until everything is agreed. Now, the latest on the actual document itself was that the text of the agreement is about 20 pages long and would see Iran come back into compliance with the deal in exchange with its nuclear commitments under the deal in exchange for the U.S. lifting sanctions that are deemed incompatible with the deal. And there's been some back and forth on that issue because it's one of those things where it's in the eye of the beholder, and subjective. What the Americans view to be incompatible with the deal has previously not been that has not been sufficient as far as the Iranians are concerned, that wasn't enough actual sanctions relief. Raisi, the president, told a summit of natural gas exporting nations in Qatar that the U.S. must show their desire to lift the main sanctions. To reach an accord, it's necessary to guarantee the interests of the Iranian people, in particular the lifting of sanctions, and to give a strong guarantee and end dossiers of a political character. the Iranians have demanded that all sanctions, including those imposed on the country before the Trump administration, be lifted as a part of the deal. Some of the major issues that still remain are the sanctions on the Ayatollah himself and his entourage, as well as the foreign terrorist organization designation on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Now, but as we've seen and discussed before, the Biden administration is under pressure from hardliners in the Senate and in the House, and the Iranians are kind of dealing with the same thing. Just because there was a letter written by the vast majority of Iran's parliament, which is largely filled with hardliners, and they said essentially that they want all sanctions lifted, and they want the Americans, who they didn't have some very understandably, they described them and the Europeans, basically the Americans being very dishonest, and the Europeans is just basically being lemmings and weak, and just doing whatever the Americans tell them to do, which actually has been essentially the case all the way through these negotiations we've been covering. But what they want to see is a lifting of all sanctions, regardless of the reason: terrorism, missiles, any of the terrorism sanctions, the missile sanctions, the nuclear sanctions, the human rights sanctions, whether they're under the umbrella of the Countering America's Adversaries through Sanctions Act or the Iran Sanctions Act itself. So they want to see all these things lifted, and they say that until those demands are satisfied, they don't think they wouldn't, support a return to the deal. But the foreign minister of Iran apparently said that that's the idea that they were going to get everything they wanted, that they said that they wanted up front, was not possible. And ultimately, the decision rests with Raisi anyway. So, or actually, excuse me, the ultimate decision rests with Khamenei, the Ayatollah. So. Now, also in early February, or late February, I should say, excuse me, we're getting reports that, oil prices were dipping because it appeared that a deal was, we're very close to inking the deal, and that there was great hopes for Iranian oil exports to come back online. So that's kind of where we were. The expectation was that a deal was going to happen any day, and still basically is. But as I said, that there's this new issue with the Russians. So my article, I'd start off by talking about how it appears that we are very close. The Europeans have gone back home. They're taking pictures of their teams and thanking them for all their work, sort of indicating that they believe talks have practically succeeded, that their work is done for all intents and purposes. And there's kind of there's an implication that the Americans and the Iranians need to work out the so-called political decisions amongst themselves. Although I have seen that at least last week, Mikhail Ulyanov, the Russian envoy in Vienna, was saying that he doesn't expect those direct talks to take place anytime soon. So, although he also was saying, very similar things, that they were 1 minute from the finish line, or talks had reached the finish line. White House, Jen Psaki again said yesterday that we're getting closer to a deal, but that important components still need to be decided. And again, because of the sanctions blitz on Russia, I think that we're seeing some shifts even among usually very hawkish lawmakers like Senator Chuck Schumer, who's now throwing his support behind the talks to restore the deal. And on MSNBC recently, Pete Buttigieg, I think that's how you pronounce his last name, he said on MSNBC that Biden has put buying oil from Iran on the table. We also know that the White House sent a delegation to Venezuela as well for the same purpose. And he got attacked by Republicans who were obviously trying to throw a wrench into a return to the deal, and people like Ted Cruz have already vowed to subvert any return to the JCPOA and tear it up as soon as they get another Republican in office, which is another real problem here, because I don't really see how realistically the Americans can provide a guarantee that that won't happen. Now, what's mainly going on here at this point is the Americans and the Western diplomats are, they sound very positive, but at the same time, they almost feel like they're rushing the Iranians. So recently it was reported that, just maybe yesterday actually, that it was on the 7th, that Ali Bagheri Khani, who's the lead negotiator for Iran in Vienna, was going to return home for consultations in the capital and then come back. And the expectation was that there would be further expert talks and formal sort of talks amongst the delegations there. But then Enrique Mora, who is the EU coordinator for all the talks there, he tweeted, just to clarify, there are no longer, quote, expert level talks, no, quote, formal meetings. It is time in the next few days for political decisions to end the Vienna talks. The rest is noise. So that's a little, unsettling, of course. Now, the Iranians are saying, the indication I get is that while everybody seems to assume that a deal is about, if it's all but signed, they're saying that they have red lines that they will not, be. The quote was that they won't allow the West's haste to force them to accept a deal without first fulfilling their red lines on the economic issues. And they're the same red lines they've always been, which is they want to guarantee that regardless of who wins in the coming years, who takes the Oval Office, that sanctions won't be reimposed and there won't be another unilateral exit from the deal, a U.S. exit. And they have a reason to be especially concerned because, as Trita Parsi pointed out a long time ago last year when we were covering this, back, I think he wrote that. I don't remember when he wrote it, but it was about the issue when it turned out Biden wouldn't even commit to not lifting sanctions for the rest of his term. But one of the points that Trita had made was that if they return to the deal and, at that point, if they want to reimpose sanctions, once the Americans are back in the deal, they have, the ability to do the snapback mechanism at the UN, and those sanctions could be even worse for Iran. So they have a real concern at that point, and they want to make sure that's one of Parliament's demands to ensure that that doesn't happen. So the Iranians want that guarantee. They want to make sure that they can clarify the scope of sanctions relief, which it always seems like the Iranians want more than the Americans are willing to give. They still want that verification mechanism to guarantee the relief. And so Hossein Amir Abdollahian, the foreign minister, has made, very clear that this, the whole idea of a ministerial meeting where they all sort of certify the deal and it's, basically the deal is done. That's not going to happen until Iran is satisfied that these demands have been met. So again, like I said, even though the Russians said last week that that they're at the finish line, now we have Lavrov over the weekend, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, saying that they require written guarantees that their trade and military technical cooperation and investment with Iran will not be impeded by the current sanctions avalanche on Russia that's led by the U.S. And as Jason Ditz, I quote in my article, he says, key aspects of the Iran deal involve Russia, both economic ties and processing of the enriched uranium. The Russians are saying they think it needs to be clear, given all the U.S. sanctions on Russia, that they won't get in the way of the Iran deal's terms. So initially, there was a senior Iranian official who was interviewed by Reuters who said that this is not constructive, that it was sort of getting in the way of the talks here. Let's see, I actually have the quotes. He's saying there is an understanding that by changing its position in the Vienna talks, Russia wants to secure its interests in other places. This move is not constructive for the Vienna talks. And what Lavrov was saying was it would have all been fine, but the avalanche of aggressive sanctions that have erupted from the West, which I understand have yet to be stopped, demand additional understanding by lawyers above all. He says, we want an answer, a very clear answer. We need a guarantee that these sanctions will not in any way touch the regime of trade, economic, and investment relations, which is laid down in the JCPOA. And he points out that under the deal, Russia and China would be allowed to help Iran develop its civilian nuclear program in accordance with the non-proliferation rules, and that sanctions would not be able to affect those projects. And he says there are still several topics which our Iranian colleagues want more clarity on, and we consider those fair demands. And that is what the latest I've heard from Saeed Khatizbeh, for instance, was that they were waiting for further clarification from their diplomatic channels with Russia, and that they would prefer to keep these issues separate from the Vienna talks. But at the same time, that anonymous official, that senior official who was saying that it's not constructive, I've seen some sort of mixed signals here. So the Western diplomats that have been interviewed have said that Iran is very upset, although they're not talking about it that much. And I think that's interesting because the Iranians were very supportive of Russia after its invasion of Ukraine. Not like they were cheering it on. They were saying that they want the war to end and for there to be a peaceful, diplomatic solution. But they blamed the entire situation on the West and on NATO. And I think the Ayatollah actually said something about the American military mafia is to blame for all this. And I think there were also statements from Katiz Beyda and Amir Abdollahian, not as like radical as that, but more formal versions of that sort of idea that American imperialism and NATO expansion had led to this crisis. Now, Reuters reported then that Saeed Khatibzadeh said, this was yesterday, that a deal can be reached in the shortest time, and Iran's peaceful nuclear cooperation should not be limited and affected by any sanctions, including Iran's peaceful cooperation with Russia and China. And they said Russia's approach to reaching a collective agreement in Vienna to date has been constructive. So it's almost like they walked back whatever that senior official told Reuters. The foreign minister of Iran is saying, while standing firm and maintaining our red lines, we won't allow any foreign actors to impact our national interests. And we had the Russian ambassador to Iran saying that there was a misunderstanding about Lavrov's comments without elaborating. And then again, as I point out in the article, Amir Abdollahian spoke with Lavrov on the phone yesterday and said it's clear that the Islamic Republic of Iran's cooperation with no country, including Russia, should be impacted by the atmosphere of sanctions. And then we had Ali Shamkhani say in a tweet, he's Iran's security chief, that it is understandable that all countries act based on their national interests in Vienna, and he pledged that Iran was searching for creative ways to achieve a successful conclusion of the talks. And another tweet, he maintains that Washington's delay in making a decision is the main reason the talks have been delayed. And we have, again, the Western diplomats saying that the overwhelming majority of issues have been resolved. But there's, again, that's not exactly clear, but it could be that they're kind of most likely that they're towing the American line. I will say one of the things that I originally had in the article, I took it out because it seemed to have resolved itself, was this situation with the IAEA, because there have been concerns, long held concerns about these small amounts of processed uranium particles that have been found at 3 or 4 undeclared sites in Iran, where the Israelis and the Americans have, always build up suspicion about it. The IAEA, maintains that they've never received answers about what all this was. And so it's as Jason Ditz has pointed out, that every time talks seem to be going in a good direction or diplomacy with Iran, someone brings this up, whether it's the IAEA, Tel Aviv, or Washington. And so the Iranians have been saying in the last couple of weeks that they want to see this finally come to an end. And they said these politically motivated inquiries, they have to stop. It's unprofessional. And, these particles date back 2 decades ago. So, we should end this. And at first, the IAEA came back and they were kind of provocative, and they were like, well, we'll never shut the inquiry down, and that's not how that's not how the agency works. But this weekend, so there was kind of a back and forth, but then Rafael Grossi, the director general of the IAEA, visited Tehran this weekend, met with the foreign minister, met with the nuclear chief of Iran, and they worked out a deal. Basically, the Iranians are going to present documents by the end of June. I think the way one of the articles explained it was that that month ends on the 21st on the Iranian calendar, so they'll provide the documents by then. And then Grossi is to present the findings and the conclusions to the board of governors of the organization. But everybody involved seems to portray what happened this weekend as effectively resolving the issue. I also noted that in Al Jazeera, though, again, like Jason was talking about, the Israelis using this as a way to, basically stop any kind of détente or successful diplomacy with Iran. It was Naftali Bennett who was on the phone, the Prime Minister of Israel, with Grassi, agitating him to keep this inquiry open and to keep pushing the issue. And so then he went to Tehran. They have this joint statement, and supposedly he was going to get in touch with Bennett after that. But I think that for all intents and purposes, this is no longer a problem. Now, again, the last thing, one of the last things is that, again, I think that this issue with the Russians is still yet to be seen. There's a lot of like mainstream reporting is saying like, oh, I don't know, this could be the end of the agreement. We thought there was going to be an agreement, but now, but I think the Iranians are going to work something out with the Russians, and they're looking out for their interests. They're again in a very difficult position. But the Chinese have also requested that they get clarification on this issue as well. They don't want sanctions to mess with their business with Iran. And that is essentially it. The Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz came out this week and said that the world should mobilize against Iran, and that our attacks on Iran, military and otherwise, will continue whether there's a deal or not. I don't think we talked about this before because I think it happened in the interim since we last talked about Iran, but Bennett was doing his usual thing, and the Israelis were kind of throwing cold water on the progress. And the actual, I think it was the State Department that came out and said, hey, we're not going to make the same mistake Trump did, and what you're doing is basically not helpful. And I wasn't expecting that. And again, the Israelis sent their diplomats to Vienna to try and, obviously, I think, to thwart the talks, right? But I don't think it had any effect. And I think that was an indication as well that they were getting desperate. And so the Americans, again, I'm just pointing out that I don't think the Israelis are that much of a factor at this point right now. I think it's right. They seem to be very, very close to inking this thing and going back into the JCPOA. Again, if the red lines are met by if the Iranians' red lines are met, and if this Russia thing is resolved. And I think that's actually most of what I've got. So
right.
We'll see here what happens next.
Yeah, I'll add Connor on the Israel part. The IRGC came out today, that's Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, and announced that 2 of their soldiers have been killed in Syria by Israeli airstrikes sometime in the past week, without providing a whole lot of details. My guess is that those aren't losses that Iran would throw the deal away over. They've sustained those for quite a while without giving too many responses to Israel. But at the same time, if those airstrikes really do uptick, there was also an Israeli strike that killed 2 Syrian civilians in the past week. These could be things that do throw cold water on the agreement, and if it is very close or something like that to gain in it or not, it could shift the dynamics a little bit and change it. But we should get in.
Yeah, I believe there was a strike on Damascus just a day or two ago, reportedly on the airport. I was reading, Jason was covering that on antiwar.com. So yeah, they must be, they're still bombing the country every week, but as he said, that's almost at this point, unfortunately, because the Russians can't, even with the joint air patrols with Syria, can't seem to put a stop to any of this. And there's not much of a deterrent factor. And Israel seems to get away with it for a lot of reasons. But I don't know. I'm remaining optimistic that won't necessarily get in the way. I think the Israelis are pretty desperate, but I think they've blown their wad in terms of what they can do at this point.
All right, Connor. Now let's move on and talk about the situation in Ukraine. And continuing coverage the same way I mostly have, I just want to start with what's going on the ground in Ukraine, where it appears that Russia is pushing its offensive a little bit into cities. There's a report that they've started to move in a little bit, particularly from the north, east, and west on the city of Kiev. I'm not sure how they're doing on that southern offensive yet or anything like that, but apparently there are still methods for people to get out of the city, although bridges being destroyed and things like that have created problems and made it more difficult for that to happen. But it does seem people can get out of Kiev still. And one, I guess, obstacle and one thing to remember is that I believe 18 to 60-year-old men are just not allowed to leave and are facing a general mobilization conscription in Ukraine right now. And so those people are not able to flee. I'm not sure, if maybe young women are choosing to stay and fight too because, their male partners or whatever are conscripted, or I'm sure when they have families, then they take the kids away or something like that, which is probably the better decision. But anyways, that is going on. And so while there are people leaving, I think the refugee count is now up to 1.7 million, and those are almost all, I think 50,000 people are reported to have gone into like Russia or Belarus, but almost all going into Poland, Hungary, or Romania, I believe. Oh, and Moldova. Now, the Western countries are advising people not to go to Russia. I guess it gets complicated depending on where you are. There are some cities, Ukrainian cities, that are located along the border with Belarus, are closer to the Donbas. And so, it may not be possible to open up a humanitarian corridor all the way from the border of Poland to to Belarus and these eastern Ukrainian cities. It's just very far, and so the quickest way out of the war zone may be into Russia, but that does create some other complications. And so those, just to understand some of the dynamics, some of the things going on. But this isn't unlike other wars. This is something that Sunnis faced in Iraq, right, where there were humanitarian corridors open up, and of course there were times where like ISIS shot the people fleeing the city. But if you were a Sunni, particularly a Sunni male, and you decided to leave the city through any place that would put you into the hands of the Iraqi government or the Shia militias that were backed by the United States in Iraq, you were liable to be tortured and killed. And so these are complications of war, right? Just in general, this isn't unique to Ukraine or anything like that. Now, there was reports today that the humanitarian corridor in Sumy, I'm guessing it's how I say it, Sumy or Soumy. I've seen it spelled both ways. That humanitarian corridor did successfully allow thousands of people to leave. There is a lot more struggles around the city of Mariupol, where they are trying to open up a humanitarian corridor. And I wrote this up for antiwar.com on Sunday, titled Mariupol ceasefire collapses, leaving hundreds of thousands without power or water. And so the city is of 400,000 people, and there are estimated 200,000 people trying to leave. This city is located, I don't know if it's right on the Sea of Azov, between the Crimean peninsula and the Donbas region of Ukraine, but not too far from the coastline there. And so they opened up a 60-kilometer long humanitarian corridor. Charles Stratford was on the ground for Al Jazeera and reported that some families were taking people out, but that there were no signs of a convoy. So look, if you're looking to evacuate 200,000 people from a city, you're not going to do that by passenger cars in a war zone. You're going to do that by buses, I think. And so the fact that the buses didn't go, the city's like security council and city council claimed that was because of Russian fighting. It's worth noting that particularly in the city of Mariupol, the neo-Nazi Azov battalion is largely in control of the security apparatus in and around that city. Now, I want to make clear that this isn't the case for every single Ukrainian city, that the defenders are the Azov battalion, are neo-Nazis, or anything like that. But certainly in this case, they do seem to be very embedded in this particular city. And so it gives the civilians there a terrible, terrible choice. And you either are fleeing to the Russian held areas, or you're stuck with the neo-Nazis. There was a report that it did seem to correct and everything. There was quite a bit of investigation, including talking to the person who was alleged to have filmed the video where two people were, trying to leave the city, were killed by the city guard, which would be the Azov battalion, and then two people trying to give aid. One of those people was shot, or both were shot. One shot and killed, the other one fled. You could see video of it, and certainly if that video is authentic, these were civilians just trying to provide aid that were fired upon. And again, they, this isn't just a video. They did interview the person who was injured and everything like that. Apparently, there's a large number of Greek civilians in this city, and so that's, I guess, complicated because, as I've talked about in the past on the show, the Azov battalion in particular, the Ukrainian brand of neo-Nazis are, supremacists of their particular, ethnic race, right? The Ukrainians, the Aryan Ukrainians. And so, Greeks certainly don't fit that description. And there's, I'm sure, a concern for the Greeks of staying in that area. So that's just some of what's going on the ground. There's reports that the fighting has picked up, including Russian airstrikes and artillery fire around the city of Odessa, which is one of the key Black Sea cities in Ukraine. Now, there's been false reports at least 3 times that city was under attack, and so I'm being very careful on any reporting, particularly around Odessa, because it's been incorrect a few times. So yeah, I think that's what I have on reporting on the ground in Ukraine. Of course, there's fighting going on all over the place. Casualty numbers. The UN officially says there are 400 dead civilians. Looking at the fighting, that seems like, that's definitely the minimum. I'm assuming that's higher. I believe that's like the UN counting what they've been able to confirm civilians dead. And so, like in any war, the number of civilians you're able to confirm is going to be lower than the actual number of civilians dead, just because some car traveling on some road in Ukraine got hit by a shell, and those people haven't been counted yet. My guess is in Ukraine that that most people will end up getting counted, and I'll explain why here. So like where Yemen, where the UN numbers for years were by a factor of 10 or more low on the number of people who died. And those were just estimates too. Those aren't even official counts. In Syria and Iraq, particularly during the ISIS war, the UN numbers were off, but not by a factor of 10, it doesn't seem, if you look at what Air Wars has reported and things like that. And now when you're going to Ukraine, where they've had a war going on for 8 years that did have international monitors and everything like that there, my guess is that there's a system of reporting that has been set up and that is a little bit more familiarized with people in Ukraine, that's making it so that they're able to report this information just a little bit quicker and more accurately, because that infrastructure is already in place in the country. But that again doesn't mean that the number is only like 500 or something like that. I don't know at this point. My guess is that the count isn't off by as much as it's been in Yemen or some of these Middle Eastern wars. So then the Russian and Ukrainian numbers, the U.S. is reporting that 2,000 plus Russians have died. My guess is that the U.S. is high on this. I can't tell. There's so much destroyed equipment and pictures of it, at least coming out from Ukraine, that certainly suggests that, hundreds of soldiers have died on each side of this conflict. I think Russia admits to, I think, how many, Connor? 500 plus now is the Russian number that they're admitting to. I haven't seen a really good count from Ukraine. I think Ukraine claims to have killed like 10,000 plus right? Russians now, which doesn't seem right at all, just judging by war zones and things, what we've seen. It would take far more destruction to kill 10,000 plus Russians, especially when you consider that again, one factor that we don't understand, or at least I don't know yet about the Russian military, is how well they're able to care trauma for people who get shot, get shrapnel wounded on, serious burns on the battlefield. They're not that far from Belarus and Russia, where you would assume that they would have, advanced medical trauma centers and everything like that. And so if the Russian casualty count really is like only around 500, it may be that they're just able to save so many lives based on the logistics of where the medical facilities are in this situation. And it could be the same thing on the Ukrainian side as well, where my guess is that they're able to evacuate even if the Ukrainian hospitals start to become overwhelmed, destroyed, low on supplies and capacity and everything like that. You would guess that they'd be able to move them out of Poland, where in Yemen they can't fly injured people out because of the Saudi blockade and things like that. And so, infections and things like that will kill in Yemen, where I'm not sure we're certainly not yet at that point in Ukraine. And of course, in war zones, anybody like the people of Mariupol could get stranded and things like that. And so, maybe in limited cases, but it just doesn't seem like we are quite there in the humanitarian crisis situation for Ukraine yet. So those are the numbers, the best I could tell at this point. The West is continuing to send in weapons. We have Australia joining now the Western nations and sending in weapons. Myself and Will Porter wrote this up for the Libertarian Institute yesterday. Australia joins NATO in shipping anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, and we write that they have devoted $50 million in arms, and Scott Morrison says that our missiles are already on the ground. The New York Times reported that 17,000 NATO anti-tank missiles had entered Ukraine within the past week. This seems way high on my part, or to me, and that skepticism is shared by Congressman Mike Waltz, I think it's Waltz, who said that, he thinks the number is high, but it's not that high. He was in the military. So, that may give him an idea of how difficult it is to ship 17,000 anti-tank missiles. My guess is it's pretty difficult, and especially given the current situation in Ukraine, where they're probably looking to do this a little bit more clandestinely, and not just flying them in and taking pictures at the airport like they were doing a couple weeks ago, is going to really slow this down. Now, I have seen pictures of, and, just openly tweeted by Ukrainian government accounts, that these missiles are being distributed directly to the Azov battalion. And so I do think there's a real concern, something like you have in Syria or Iraq, right? Libya is another example of this, the Sahel region, where if you move weapons into these zones, the most militant people are going to get their hands on them and fight with them the most aggressively, and so they're going to end up with more power. And while, it would be completely wrong to say that, Syria is just loaded up with a bunch of head chopping jihadists and things like that, nonetheless, for the past, 10 years or so, those people have held an extraordinary amount of power in Syria and have been absolutely brutal to the population. And so, I want to be careful to talk about the Nazi thing in Ukraine, because, there are legitimate Nazis there. Those people are being flooded with weapons and are going to be extremely dangerous with those weapons. However, I am continuously concerned that, when Putin says we want to denazify Ukraine, he's not talking about getting rid of the Azov battalion. He's talking about, removing Ukrainian influence, the Russia versus Ukraine, ethnic split in Ukraine, really shifting that, and maybe not by large pogroms against Ukrainians or anything like that, but if you are in any way like waving a blue and yellow flag and suddenly that comes synonymous with, having a swastika flag or something like that, that's a real type of cultural and political control that could be exerted in Ukraine, and certainly something to, be aware of whenever, because, I think we're right as libertarians, and, the points that we continue to make, that, hey, this is why we cannot send our weapons to Ukraine, that kind of thing. Look, the U.S. exploits it in all over the Middle East to just kill Arab men writ large, right? That was Obama's official policy, that if you were like a 16 to 45-year-old Arab men anywhere between Morocco and in the Philippines, if we want to drop a drone bomb on you, we just assume that you're guilty of terrorism, and that's the way it works. And another part of that aspect we could talk about here is in the past week, Israel has been shooting teenage Palestinians who have been, throwing Molotov cocktails. And at the same time, that gets zero coverage in our mainstream media, where the Ukrainians throwing Molotov cocktails at the Russian tanks is met with absolute praise. Those people are heroes. The Palestinians are terrorists. And so, we could see some of this dichotomy and how it works compared to the different sides here. There's also the warplane issue on Poland, and so this has seemed to come and go a couple of times now, Connor. And to me, that suggests that at least some parties on the clandestine side are trying to set this up where they're going to try to move Poland's and other NATO member states who have MiG-29 fighter jets. They're going to try to move those into Ukraine. Now, the initial plan was, I think, 4 or 5 different nations are going to donate 70, and I think a Russian threat kind of bat that down. And so then just this weekend, as covered on the show, and me and I think Will covered this one for the Libertarian Institute, explained that Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, had said on the Sunday morning show that, hey, we greenlighted a plan from Poland to facilitate these weapons, these warplanes going to Ukraine. Furthermore, the U.S. was going to backfill Poland's fighter jet fleet with, I'm guessing, American-made planes. And so this is a great way to sell F-35s or F-16s or whatever Poland wants, make Lockheed Martin a whole bunch of money. And, of course, I'm sure the MIDs will be destroyed just about as soon as they get into Ukraine and could possibly spark a wider war in Europe. Now, one other thing to note on this, there are apparently, and I've seen this confirmed seemingly from both sides of the conflict, Russia made the claim, and I believe I saw from a NATO member state that this was the case, that there are Ukrainian aircraft that, for whatever reason, landed in border state countries. I believe a couple in Romania. Now, my guess is there could be a couple of reasons for this, like fuel or something like that, or Russia destroyed all the runways that these planes could possibly land on, and so they were essentially forced to fly and land there because that was just the only way to do it. And it wasn't, my guess is it wasn't a situation like you had in Afghanistan where people were hopping in the aircraft to just flee Kabul. It wasn't that it was more of a logistical problem in trying to, land the aircraft and everything like that, which would suggest that there are possibly, fighter pilots in these countries of, Ukrainian fighter pilots that are able to hop in any kind of plane and, jump back into the war zone. Now, then today we got an announcement from Poland that they had come up with a plan where they were going to transfer their entire fleet of MiG-29s to Germany, and from there the U.S. would be able to do what they wanted with them. Then the Pentagon came out and said, oh, no, this isn't happening. And so there, I guess a couple things could have played out here, Connor, and I want to be very clear about this now we've seen how this has happened. It's maybe possible that Blinken just screwed up, right? Like, shouldn't have said it and did. It's also possible that maybe Blinken said on purpose to undermine the plan, that, making this public that was supposed to be clandestine is going to cause it to get on attention that ultimately ends up killing it. I don't know. Another option to this is that, the Polish thing is just coming because they want new aircraft, right? And so they're trying to get rid of these MIDs to get some free warplanes from the United States. And honestly, that sounds like a perfectly logical explanation to all this. Now, it could be that this is actually the end of it and it's not going to happen, but my guess is that they are not done trying to ship these warplanes into Ukraine, and we're going to see another go of this in the coming weeks, assuming that the fighting stays going here. Now, on the fighting and negotiations, we have, I think, a pretty major statement here from Ukraine saying that they're open to non-NATO models. And while this comes far short of what Ukraine is going to need to agree to get Russia to call off their invasion here, it is, I think a step in the right direction. And so this was an interview between Fox News and the lead negotiator for Ukraine, who said that, he's willing for trade-offs and we are ready to discuss non-NATO models, but seemed pretty hardline on other key issues like Ukraine's territorial integrity. Now, yesterday, that's Monday the 7th, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said that his country had seen that, they were getting the cold shoulder from NATO, and so they were willing to discuss neutrality. And I believe, while not saying they're willing to recognize Crimea as Russian territory, they did say they were willing to negotiate on that issue. And so it does seem, Connor, and look, there's a lot of possibilities here, right? Putin could just be saying that his current demands are he wants a change of the Ukrainian constitution to officially say that, the country has neutrality, and he wants let's see what else. And then a recognition of Crimea as independent or as part of Russia, the Donbas as independent. And I believe he dropped the demilitarization part, or maybe that's a part of the constitutional changes now.
Potentially, yeah. The way it was described, I think, with that piece in the Jerusalem Post, because they said Bennett was told about, because I guess Putin had told Naftali Bennett, that they've given Zelensky the final offer, and that it includes, neutrality, recognizing the Donbas Republics, recognizing the Russian Federation's ownership of Crimea, and shrinking the military, which, it's not exactly the same thing as the original demands. And I think they said that it's difficult but not impossible. So, and it sounds like, and there were just reports coming out. I was reading at antiwar.com about how Zelensky is saying he's, cooling off on the whole NATO idea that, the American NATO's scared. They're not going to confront Russia. And that he says, what do you say? That the people who voted for me are not ready to surrender. But he did indicate that he's ready to talk about Crimea and the Donbass, and that he sort of framed it like, we're not going to take Russian ultimatums, but absolutely we're ready to discuss this. So, that could be very good. If he's such a good leader, that would be the right decision to make, because unfortunately, as you've discussed before, and even Brzezinski outlined it, in that panel in 2014, they know Ukraine can't win this. So the idea is to make a lot of money for the military-industrial complex and just bleed Russia to spite them or something. This needs to be wrapped up. So hopefully there's some real progress on that basis coming up here.
Right. And, there does seem to be still some meaningful resistance from the Ukrainians. The Russians aren't just walking into cities. And in fact, when Russia has taken cities, there's been some footage that definitely seems to show some protests breaking out, pro-Ukrainian protests in those cities. And so, it's very possible that the Ukrainian resistance will morph into more of a nonviolent one, and it would be interesting to see how that ends up playing out, because it's not going to generate the results that the Americans want, and but it costs ultimately really help the Ukrainians. But yet to be seen how all this plays out. Now, as you point out, Connor, none of the weapons that they're really talking about, the fighter planes are a little bit different, I guess, because those are, advanced aircraft that, while I don't really think there's anything that these are ultimately going to do other than get shot down, and, it'll be great for Lockheed Martin and Boeing, who make the fighter aircraft, right? Because they're going to sell a whole bunch to these Eastern European countries who get to get rid of their MiGs at the cost of the lives of the Ukrainian pilots. But, particularly the weapons, the anti-tank weapons, all this, these are just insurgency weapons. And so, you could maybe have happen here what you had happen in Afghanistan, a 10-year-long war where the Russians end up leaving in the end or something like that. But, the Russians lost 15,000 soldiers in that war, and the Afghans lost 1 to 1.5 million. So that wasn't a good trade-off for the Afghans. It's hard to say that they won that war, especially given how the Ned's 40 years or so went for that country once the Russians actually, or 30 years, I guess, once the Russians actually did end up leaving. Couple more stories to mention here, Connor, before we wrap up. There will be talks on Thursday in Turkey, and as you're breaking down, there is some possibility that those talks could net something, net something significant here. Maybe it's a local ceasefire or not local, maybe it's a temporary ceasefire to start, but then, talks ongoing and within a few days, they actually ink something and we get this conflict wrapped up. And, best case scenarios that, however, if that doesn't happen, one of the risks we run is that Putin is making a lot of threats towards the West about not only their sanctions, but also the weapon shipments and things like that, potentially putting a no-fly zone over Ukraine, being an act of war. One very disturbing thing, Connor, is I really don't think people understand what a no-fly zone is. And so, there's plenty of people, including elected U.S. senators like Marco Rubio and Chris Murphy, who understand what a no-fly zone is and are saying, no way in hell are we going to do one of these over Ukraine. And so you could listen to me say it, but you could also listen to those guys, because they essentially make the argument the same way that, like, there's a fantastic article today in the Quincy Institute by Responsible Statecraft by William Hardtongue and Anatole Levin, where they, just go through and break down how much of an absolute disaster, stupid thing this would be. Now, the bad news is reported by Fox News. I forget what his name is, but then I saw that Idris Ali, the Reuters Pentagon reporter, had apparently felt comfortable enough to tweet it out that they are going to move more Patriot missile batteries into Eastern Europe. And so it's not exactly clear that those are going to be used to establish a new fly zone over Ukraine, but are going to end up being very, very provocative on the Russian side, because, of course, those Patriot missiles have the MK-41 launchers, which can hold strategic nuclear, tipped cruise missiles, and they could instantly almost change it from firing the Patriots to the cruise missiles. And so
did Idris Ali say which country they were expecting to put them in? I saw the tweet, but I can't remember.
No. There was no specifics there, and I would guess we're not going to get that yet. My guess is that they're probably moving the systems into countries that already have them, Poland and Romania, but it's at this point unclear on that.
This has been an extremely neurologic issue for Putin for years and years and years. There's that famous moment where he's speaking with a bunch of Western reporters in 2016, and he's saying to them, like, how can I get it through to you? Do you understand what's actually happening here? Like, this was the main, as McGovern was covering the whole time, this was one of the absolute top issues Putin wanted to discuss. So this is, maybe they'll walk it back, sort of like the talk about sending the fighter planes, the Polish, MiG-29s and everything, and where they seem to be, a lot of it seems to be sending firearms. I think the Czech Republic sent like 40,000 different firearms, and the anti-tank missiles and more Stingers that we keep seeing. There was that whole story about the Germans, what were those rockets that they were, I forget what the name of it was, but they were so old. I think they were 35 years old, and they've been rendered declared obsolete maybe since 2014 or something like that, that the wooden crates they were in were so moldy that when they were opening them up, the military had to wear protective equipment, and that apparently there's cracks in them. They're not even safe to fire or use. The motors are having all kinds of problems. So it's possible that they're just going along with the Brzezinski plan and sending the arms that we were talking about, mostly the Stingers and the Javelins. But to move those in, I certainly hope that gets walked back, because that's extremely provocative. It's hard to pick something even worse, except, obviously the no-fly zone.
Yep. Just real quick here, Connor, a couple more. U.S. is planning on moving some more troops into the Baltics, and the Baltics are NATO is considering making those troop movements permanent. The weapon shipments are coming into Ukraine from a secret airfield somewhere in Eastern Europe. And so we're getting some details on that, but not a whole lot so far on actually how the weapons are getting into Ukraine. But, they again claim to be moving a lot in. And then the last thing I want to mention before we wrap up here, Connor, is this article I wrote for antiwar.com on Sunday titled Washington Seeks Access to Venezuela Oil as Gas Prices Spike. And this is basically comes, Connor, as of course, gas prices are going up. The U.S. today announced that they are not going to import Russian oil. That's a little complicated. That they're saying that we're not going to do any new contracts. We're going to try to end existing ones, but Russian oil is still going to come into the U.S. For, I guess, the foreseeable future at this point. The UK made a similar announcement today. Russia also announced that they have given Putin the power to limit exports or to ban exports and imports from certain countries, but it's unclear what he's going to do with that so far. Of course, as you brought up the Iran deal, anything that could be happening with that could certainly play, in the same dynamics that we see in Venezuela, right, where the U.S. wants to make a deal with these governments to get their oil onto the international market, to give them more leverage against Russia. And that is certainly a dynamic that, we've talked about on this show, that the more countries the U.S. sanctions, the more leverage it gives all those countries that are sanctioned together. And so, with oil prices going up, we're already seeing this. And so, it doesn't seem that Maduro's going to have to give up any power or anything like that, Connor. The U.S. is just ready for a temporary relief of sanctions on Venezuela under national security authorities. They had three high-level staffers, actually. The Venezuelan envoy, Jimmy Story, somebody from the National Security Council, Juan Gonzalez, and White House official Roger Carsons, all actually went to Venezuela and met with members of the Maduro government. I'm not sure if it was Maduro himself. Maduro came out and made a speech, and while he did voice support last week for Russia and Putin, he did say that, the Venezuela oil would be on the market for anyone to buy, maybe seeming to indicate that he is on board with this American plan. I think to some extent that this Venezuelan oil would be key because of not all oil underground is the same. There's different consistencies, different purities, and everything like that. And so to refine different kinds of oil into usable products like gasoline, you got to build different refineries. I believe that the oil that we get from Russia is somewhat similar to this Venezuelan oil, and it can be used to some extent in the same refineries. And so that may be why they are particularly seeking this Venezuelan oil at this point. Also, a secondary motivation, of course, will be if they are really viewing, Connor, this situation in Ukraine to be a 10 to 15 year war, basically entering a new period of a Cold War, proxy war kind of conflict. They could see Venezuela as a potential battlefield or a potential, hub by Russia, a country in South America that has friendly ties with Russia that could be used to facilitate things elsewhere in the region. And so America could see an opportunity to cut that off here, which I'm guessing is maybe even a bigger part of it than the oil. Because, as you heard, as you mentioned earlier from the transportation secretary, I'm not sure that the administration cares all that much about gas prices because it really doesn't hurt the people who donate to the Democratic Party. They probably are all driving around in their electric cars because they could afford them. So, Connor.
Yeah, I was going to say Colbert was coming out making this point about how we have a clean conscience and I'm willing to, this went viral, I think, because of just how out of touch and hypocritical and disgusting it was. But he's like, well, I'm willing to pay more money. And I forget how many, he goes, I'm willing to pay a few dollars more per gallon to have a clean conscience and not support a war. And he made a joke about how we'll buy from the good guys, Saudi Arabia or something like that. So it's just absolutely ridiculous. And I wonder also if this whole like you're saying, because initially when they said the what did Russia call it? The military technical measures that would be taken, which is kind of their way of saying, the all options are on the table kind of thing that the Americans usually say, was that they would send troops and potentially warships, more troops, or I would say, excuse me, because there are some troops in Venezuela, Russian troops, but sending warships and more military equipment to either or all three, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which. I think some people initially thought that would be certainly more likely than an actual just an invasion of Ukraine. But I wonder if this policy of putting Iran in this very kind of difficult situation where they almost have to decide, because they have these countries have very good relationships with Russia, but you wonder if there is some kind of a desire to kind of, as you say, put a wedge in that and maybe even kind of split them up. Because like I said, I was thinking, the Iranians are in an extremely tough situation here. And it just seems like it could also jeopardize the relationship with Venezuela potentially as well.
Yeah. All right, Connor, I guess we should wrap up there. So everybody check out the Libertarian Institute for everything me and Connor are doing, and antiwar.com. Thanks, Connor.
Thank you.